Today I'm painting a pink tulip. I've already sketched it out and transferred it onto the paper. I'm actually painting it at times 1.5, the original size, so that you can see it more easily for demonstration purposes. Tulips are a bit notorious for moving around, so I've sketched it out and photographed it a lot. I've probably taken about 50 or 60 photographs and selected a few which I have on my iPad on the left hand side, but I also have the actual tulip next to me as well, which is here. You can't quite see it, but just for really colour reference and the likes. So that's pinned to a board next to me because it's completely moved now, but it's still worth having there for colour and light, and it's lit from the left hand side. So I usually start with painting in the stem lightly because I feel this anchors the piece, and putting in the greens first, and I work up the whole painting in stages rather than finish off any one area. Now the stem of the tulip is very pale. I'll take another one to show you. This is another tulip, but it's got a very pale stem, and there's actually a little bit of pink in it, but we'll add that later. And what I tend to do with stems is that there's usually, as I say, the light is coming in from the left hand side and you get some quite nice highlights on it, and it's usually a slightly warmer colour in places than it is in some places than it is in other. Some areas it's more blue and some areas it's more yellow. So I tend to start with a light wash on the stem to get going. And how I do this is actually I'm using transparent yellow and cerulean blue, and I actually put wash down one side of the stem in one swoop using the yellow. And then on the other side using the blue, just to find and I take a mixture of the two and paint over it. It can help if you wet the stem first. Actually, if you wet the area first, you'll get a better flow of paint. And the mixture of the two together, I'm also adding a very small amount of permanent rose. That kills the green slightly. It's important to paint it in as smooth a sweeping stroke as you can. And that's as much as I want to add to the stem at this stage. And I'll also bring it in down below here in a minute when I do the back of this leaf, the continuation of the stem. So once I've done that, I'll start to block in the greens and the leaves. I'll need to let that stem dry first. There's a lot of variation in the greens because of the light and shade. Again, obviously this isn't the actual positioning of the plant, but you can see how light it is in some areas compared with the darker tones of the green and the leaves behind them. Right, I'm just starting to put in the background wash on the leaves. I'm using the same mixes for the stem as the cerulean with the transparent yellow and a small amount of permanent rose. So you can dampen the area first if you want to, if you prefer that. Can make it easier to flow. I'm working from back to front here with it, so I'm working forward gradually, just putting in a light wash. You need to make sure that you let all the areas dry before you move on to the next, because you don't want to touch an area that's wet. So I'm just putting in a very light wash. So as I say, it's important that you let areas where it crosses over, you don't touch them with the other colour before they've had a chance to dry, otherwise they'll run into one another. And this, where the stem curves around, where this leaf curves around the stem, I use the same technique as I used on the stem, that I used the lighter cerulean blue wash on the edge. Actually leave a bit of a highlight. It's very pale. And then when that's dry, I'll add more colour into it. This leaf behind is quite dark, but I need to let that one dry before I can touch that one. So I could do possibly this piece here or this piece here. I've overpainted my line slightly there, but I'm not worried about that in this case. I'll just soften it and let it dry. And while that's drying, you can see what the palette looks like really. I've got the three colours at the top there, and I'm mixing them together in quite a pool there, and you can see it's quite a watery pool because this is a fairly light wash. What we have here is a green that's got a fairly high light value. This is not a dark green, so I always recommend using colours to mix a highlight value green that have got a highlight value themselves. So that's why I'm using cerulean and transparent yellow, because they are light colours. If it was a dark leaf, then you would possibly use French ultramarine or Indanthrine blue to mix a more saturated green. But as I say, the tulip leaf is a very high light value. It's quite a sort of, it's got an underlying yellow, and sometimes you can put the yellow in first, and this has actually got quite a yellow bias too, but it's also got like a light blue sheen to it as well, so that's something to keep an eye on. So this is dry enough now to work on, so I'll carry on plotting in the basic colours for the leaves. Now on the larger leaf, it would be wise, I think, to wet it first, I'm going to work on this one first. Make sure there's no bits of fluff or rubber. I'm going to wet this one as well, just to show you the approach. Helps the paint smooth, flow more smooth. If you've got a highlight, you can also leave that clear. There's no real white highlights in this. So I wet it, but I don't want it to be dripping wet. I just want it damp so that the paint flows into it more easily. You can use Oxgall liquid as well to help ease the flow of paint. So it's darker on the outside edge. Keeping it all fairly light because it's easy to add to, but it's much more difficult to take away. And again, just painting the inside. And this is going to go considerably darker. I can still work on this while it's still wet. Until such a point that I feel it's starting to dry and I need to leave it alone. If I've got too much water in there, what happens is you get that sort of cauliflowering effect. And if you've got too little, you get brush marks that you don't necessarily want. That can be okay, they can be useful sometimes. That's enough for the initial coat. For this back leaf, this larger back leaf, I'm going to wet it first using a larger brush. This is a size 10 and it's just a synthetic brush, so it's not expensive. It's ideal for wetting areas. You don't need to worry too much about having a sable brush for that. Just make sure there's no bits of fluff or hair before you do the wash. So I just load the brush with water. There are some bits in it, so I need to get rid of those. It's quite a nuisance sometimes, and bits of fluff. So again, just dampening the leaf will make the paint flow more readily. I'm just going to put a wash on it again. I'm going to use that same brush actually to do it with. I'll start down the centre area because it is actually darker in the middle. You see I'm working in the direction of the leaf veins, because it can help me sometimes to mark out where there are veins and other parts of shadow. So while it's wet, I'm going to add some more to it. So there's a fold in the middle of the leaf that's darker nearer the base.
You can carry on working on it while it's wet, but there comes a point where you have to stop because it starts to dry. And I'll leave it at that so as not to overwork it while it's wet, otherwise you start to drag the paint around and make a mess. So again, that needs to dry. I can look for other areas to work on. I can work on the back side of this leaf or the edges of these two here while that one's drying, because I can't do this one because it comes into contact with that one. Or there's the other side of this as well. You can use any number of brushes, whichever feels comfortable actually, you know. I mean, although a brush is large, it doesn't necessarily mean it's any more difficult. The main thing is that a brush has a good point on it. If it's this, you need to get a good outline. Leaves tend to get paler towards the bottom. They're more yellow. I need to let that dry. It's a bit too big for that one, so I'll swap that. The other brush I'm using is actually a size 5. So you don't need particularly small brushes. What you need to be careful of with an area like this is wet, and if I do move and work up here, that I don't catch that with my hand. Normally I would work with tracing paper, which is cut around. I can open it up, lift it up, whatever, to keep the work clean. I can't do that in this situation because it rustles too much. A little bit there, which is this leaf here passing behind and through. And it's important that you make sure that everything does fit together in your drawing when you originally draw it out. So I'll leave that to dry. Now that I've laid in all of the greens, I'm going to use cobalt violet to start to just mark in a few of the shadows where they're on the flower. And it's a nice, again, light and tone, this colour, so it's quite good for shade. This really just keeps me on track with where everything is actually. It's a very light wash, just in selected areas. And as you see, it's just really giving me a little bit of shape. I use a little bit of blue on the left hand side where the highlights are, mixed into the cobalt violet. The tulips have got this veined appearance, so I'm dragging a few of those in before I put the wash on, just to, again, to give me that shape. Oh, also at the base of the flower there's a slight yellowing lighter area. It's not pink, so I'm just going to put that in. It's got some green in it as well, but I'm going to put in using a lemon yellow just to mark it out where it is. So there's actually some green in it as well, but that can go in later. Now I'm ready to start adding some pinks. On some of the shaded areas where we've got these sort of deeper areas between petals, the pinks are quite warm in there, as opposed to on the left hand side where the pinks are quite cool, where the light is. There's much cooler pinks than there are in these darker shaded areas. I'm actually going to put in some of the warmer pinks first. Keeping the bottom edge here quite light because it's what's called a bit of a disappearing edge there. And I'm using using permanent rose here. A very small amount of yellow in it. And there's some reflected light here, so I'm going to work some blue into it. Tulips have got this characteristic flattening on one side of the petal. That's what I'm trying to achieve here. In the centre there's a ridge, so it's quite helpful because it means you don't have to put a wash all over, because there's a natural break in the petal down this line. So still continuing to work on it while it's wet. It's getting to a point now I really need to think about stopping. So I'll leave it at that to dry and then add more. Start adding in some darks now. Also a little bit of dry brush. These are some of those warmer reds that there are, and I've mixed a small amount of Scarlet Lake in there. Made a bit of a mess on the edge there, so I'm going to try and remove that. Just using a flat brush that's wet. Just push it. It doesn't matter too much here because it's going to have a wash of pink on it anyway, on the edge. I'm working with the curve of the petal to put these markings in. So you need to get that rounded edge to them.